What's up everyone, Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today I'm going to show you how to replace an oil pan gasket on a 2013 BMW 135i. So, if you have a high mileage BMW with an N55 engine, chances are you probably do have some kind of oil pan gasket leak, and the reason for that is the rubber here on the gasket hardens over time, eventually it loses its seal and it starts to weep. Some of these oil leaks are not that bad, some are pretty severe, but either way, oil leaks are not good for the environment and generally not good for the engine either, so it is a good idea to go ahead and take care of the problem. With that said, we have a full kit here with all the suspension bolts we're going to have to replace, all the oil pan bolts, and we also have the windage tray and the suction pipe for the oil pump. Highly recommend to replace this while you're in there because these have been known to suffer from micro cracks, which can starve the engine of oil. So while you have the oil pan off, it's not that much more work to go ahead and replace this at the same time. Of course, we'll be changing the oil since we'll be draining it. Have to go ahead and do that. With all that said, let's talk about the tools we're going to do this job, and then we'll go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so some of the tools you're going to need for doing the oil pan gasket. First and foremost, you need a way to support the engine with the subframe removed. So keep that in mind, whether it's an engine support bar, engine hoist, blocks of wood, however you choose to do that, you need to be able to support the engine properly and safely. So safety first on that front. But past that, all of your socket sizes are going to be your traditional modern BMW things. So we have a T20, T25, T27, T30 Torx, and a T60 Torx. The T60 Torx is going to be for our belt tensioner. Past that, external Torx, E10, E12, E14 and E18 external Torx sockets, and then for 6-point sockets, we're going to have 8mm, 10mm, 13mm, 16mm, 18mm, 19mm, 21mm, and 22mm sockets in a variety of sizes and shapes. And then since we have a lot of torque to angle fasteners on this, you need a torque wrench that can do as little as 4 Newton meters and as high as 100 Newton meters, but also you're going to need a way of torque angling. So you have some torque angles upwards of 180 degrees, so whether you use a traditional torque angle gauge or you have a torque wrench that can do that, keep that in mind. Past that, if you have any electric tools, that's going to make the job a little bit easier, and some nice things to have are going to be the proper oil filter cap wrench, which, assuming you're taking on this job yourself, you probably already have. And then past that, highly recommend the hood lock tool to keep the hood in the up position just in case one of the gas support struts fails, since the hood is going to be open a lot while you're doing this job, and any kind of wiggling underneath the car could cause the hood to come down. And then past that, you know, ratchets, extensions, all that kind of stuff. Anything that's going to make the job easier, definitely want to have on hand. So first and foremost, we need to do a bunch of work up top here on the engine bay. Hood's propped, so we have this hood lift support lock in place just to make sure if one of the hood struts somehow fails, it won't come crashing down on us, so safety first. Secondly, we're going to be disconnecting the fuel injectors, the electrical connectors, and removing the spark plugs, because at the end of this we do need to prime the engine, and it is important to do that without the engine starting. So the fuel injectors being disconnected is going to make sure fuel doesn't get in there, and also the spark plugs being out of the engine's going to crank a lot easier. So just a good idea to do both, but in order to get to that point, you got to take the air box off, our suction cowl, the engine cover. Now, of course, on this vehicle, the back portion of the cowl is missing, which is a very common thing on a lot of tuned cars, E90s and E80s, since it gives you better access to the rear. So don't have to worry about that. But we're going to start up here. T20 to get these Torx screws out. All right, next up, we will disconnect the mass airflow sensor. So the little electrical connector is here. Just push down that release here and you'll pull it off. They've been on there for a while. Could be a little bit stubborn to remove, but just be patient. I'll also pop off this forward beauty cover. It's so beautiful. Next up, we're going to take a 6mm hose clamp driver. Of course, you can use a flathead screwdriver on these clamps as well, but the hose clamp driver is just as convenient. And we'll loosen that clamp there so we can pull the air box off. Pull this boot back. And then the air box is held in on a couple of grommets. You need to make sure that nothing is attached to it. For example, this bracket back here So we have a battery cable and some of the engine wiring harness. We'll just pull these off like so, because this bracket is going to come with it. And then we'll just lift this out of place. And then from here we have this silencer or acoustic covering. It's to reduce injector noise. It's kind of held in. Gotta remove these pieces here. So while trying to remove this acoustic cover, notice that our part of our V-brace is actually loose. They're both loose. So we're gonna have to fix that. That's not related to DIY. Well, actually, we'll make it related to DIY. Sometimes while doing a job, you'll find other problems. Now's the time to take care of it. But that said, this V-brace does need to come out. And also having this out is gonna make it easier to set up the engine support bar. And we have this Torx bolt right here. And that is definitely loose. And our V-brace bolt is an E18. We'll definitely make sure that one is torqued to spec when we put it back in this time, because I'm sure this is probably making some rattling noises. And then we have E14s here at the strut towers. Those were tight. Plastic, lots of plastic. So now at this point, we're going to start removing our ignition coils. And again, the reason why we're going to remove the spark plugs is anytime you do a major service on any of these engines, oil pan gasket, oil filter housing gasket, oil pump replacement, Vano sprockets, anything that involves a lubrication system outside of an oil change, the recommendation is to prime the engine, which is to crank the engine 3 times for 10 seconds to completely flush any air out of the oiling galley. That service bulletin for BMW applies to all engines. However, it did originate from N55s dying shortly after pretty common repairs. And the N55 is unique in the respect that it has a very simplified oiling circuit compared to the N52 and the N54. So a lot less oil volume in the oil galley. And it is my belief that that simplification, while it makes the Vano system more reliable compared to the N52 and N54, it does have the Achilles heel. If there's air trapped in there, it does take a little bit longer for that to get out. So BMW has a service bulletin. They apply it to all engines. It's really not a bad idea to do it anyway, but it really stems from the N55. And so we will follow that procedure. And I'd rather crank the engine freely with the spark plugs out. Make it a little bit easier on the starter. And then of course we got this great O2 sensor bracket back here. So I'm gonna take this bracket out. It's a T27 screw. That bracket holds on to the O2 sensor connectors. And that's all to get to number 5. Talked about this in other videos too. Sometimes these coils can be kind of stubborn to remove. So I like to take a flathead screwdriver, put the flathead through the connector lock, and then pull up. Just gives you a little bit more leverage. And before I pull the spark plugs out, I'm just going to disconnect our injector connectors here. This is to make sure that the injectors don't fire when we crank the engine. So you have a little release tab that we have to push forward, and then the connector pops out. So you can see this little ear right there. All you're doing on the injector is you're pushing that forward with a pick. We'll just go down the line and do them all. And now I'll go ahead and remove the spark plugs. So these are 14 millimeter 12 point. There's a special spark plug socket for that, which we offer here at FCP Euro. This one happens to be the Beirut style socket, which has the magnetic holder inside of it, which I prefer personally. And we're gonna be doing quite a bit of work here with these spark plug tubes open. So I'm just taking some lint-free shop towels here. I'm just gonna plug the holes off. If you have any plastic or rubber caps, I'll do the same thing. But I just don't want, you know, a bolt or a screw or something else falling down. So next up, we do need to get this fan out of the way since we need access to the front of the engine. But we also need to drain the oil, and there are some attachments down below that are on the fan. So I'm going to loosen our oil filter housing cap first, just a little bit, just a skosh. And then we're gonna take the cap, or our oil filter cap, and loosen that. And then we'll lift the car up, drain the oil. That'll kind of help it drain out a little bit faster. And then we'll take the splash shield off below, remove the items that are attached to the fan from below. Once the oil finishes draining, we'll lower it back down, then we'll pull the fan out. So this car has an aluminum under tray on it as opposed to the factory plastic or felt one. The factory one's gonna be held on by a bunch of 8mm screws. This one's held on by 4mm Allens. So depending on what your car has, it might vary, but we just need access to the oil pan drain plug, which is back here. And we got a little leaf, a little foliage, and I can already see the leak. So we do in fact have a leaking oil pan. And you know, I just realized I did all that to gain access to the drain plug, but I need to take this entire thing off anyway. So that was pointless. We're just gonna remove all the screws and remove the aluminum tray. And we got a couple drips, so we'll take this off to the side. All right, oil pan leak confirmed, which not really that surprising. So we're gonna go ahead and drain the oil. It's a 17mm for the drain plug. Pretty typical BMW size right there. So we could definitely sit here all day and let the oil continue to drain out of the oil pan, but there's no point in that because, well, we're dropping it anyway. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the drain plug back on with the new crush washer that's in the MAN oil filter kit. Replace the crush washer, that is a very important thing. Torque spec on this drain plug is 25 Newton meters, and we can just take care of this now. First new part installed. So this is the screw right here that holds our trans cooler to the fan shroud. This would only apply to vehicles that have the dual clutch transmission. So that is a T27. Ironically enough, a 4mm Allen also fits in there, but pretty sure it's a T27. So we'll take that screw out now. And then that'll allow us to freely pull up our fan shroud. I'm gonna take a look, make sure there's nothing else holding it in down here, but that should be it. Should be able to get everything else up from the top. So now we're back up top. We still need to pull the fan out, but we're gonna put a brand new oil filter in. We're just gonna do it now. Makes sense. We'll tighten our cap again, and then we'll pull the oil filter out. This is one of the special sockets that we offer to remove the oil filter cap or factory style oil filter caps off these engines. It's an 86mm 16 flute. Please don't use adjustable pliers or something like that on this because you'll just damage the cap and break it. There's always a little bit of residual oil left over, so we'll just pull this up straight. That'll drain back into the engine. We're using the MAN oil filter kit, the classic HU816X. Fits the N52, N54, N55 engine, N20s. And it does come with the proper O-rings and also the drain plug crush washer. So very important to install the O-rings in the correct position. Number one, this right here, that should always have an O-ring on it. Also, the cage should be present inside the oil filter housing cap. Plenty of engines have failed because somebody has broken this or failed to put it back in. This is actually the drain back block for the oil filter housing. So if we look inside here, that hole right there in the center is for the drain back for the oil filter housing back into the engine. That's so when you remove the cap, any excess oil can drain into it. If that hole is not plugged, you will have an oil pressure problem and the engine will slowly kill itself. So always replace his O-ring, always make sure the O-ring is installed, and make sure that the filter cage is installed, like so. And then the proper position for this O-ring is this groove right here. A lot of people have put it all the way up against the bottom flange of this housing. That is the incorrect location. Will cause oil leaks in most cases, but the correct position is right there. The O-ring will simply roll into position. There's no need to force it past that. So when you're all done, it should look exactly like this. We'll use some of that residual oil to lubricate the O-ring and we will reinstall it. Of course, we will clean that cap. And just like a spin-on filter, you can thread this in by hand, and usually where it bottoms out, you don't need to go any further. Now, the torque spec, it's on the cap, says 25 Newton meters. The question is by hand, did I get the 25 Newton meters? Let's see. Pretty close. Didn't really move that much, but the point is, these things do not have to be tight. You just need it bottomed out, and is that O-ring, the black one, that's what provides the seal. Sometimes these wrenches can get stuck on, so just tap it with the socket, it comes right off, or your ratchet rather. Now that we've accomplished that, let's get the fan out. First and foremost, we'll remove our connector here. There's two locks. There's one on the bottom, there's one here on the top. That one on the bottom is in a kind of a annoying place. So I'm just gonna use a little pry tool here to push against it, so I can't really get my finger in there. There we go. We'll put the connector kind of over here to the side. And then we have our expansion tank hose, which conveniently comes over the top of the fan shroud. Not in the way at all. And we will push that off to the side. These can be brittle if they're old, so be careful. They may not have that much flexibility like this one does, and they can break easily, so just be careful. And since this is an aftermarket radiator, it's using a 10mm screw. The factory screws, if I recall correctly, it's a T30 self-tapping or T27 self-tapping, so that's normally a Torx, but in this case it's a 10mm. And this has the CSF racing radiator in it, so it's a triple pass radiator, additional cooling. So from here we should be good to pull straight up. We'll just make sure it doesn't snag anything as it's coming up. There we go, comes right out. Just gotta make sure that these little alignment tabs are clearing as they're coming out. And then right here, that's where the transmission oil cooler bolts to from underneath. So if it has a DCT transmission, just make sure you remove that screw before you start pulling up. Otherwise, you're in for a world of hurt. Next up, I need to remove the serpentine belt. Later on, when we go to remove the oil pan, the power steering pump pulley needs to be removed in order to get bolts out of the power steering pump to then release the oil pan. So the belt needs to come out in order to do that. The tensioner is right here. We need a T60 socket, and we're gonna rotate it clockwise as you're facing the engine. That'll release the tension, and we'll be able to slide the belt off. So you'll see the little hole there in the tensioner right next to our pulley. That is where the lock from the factory is. It normally come with a pin. Now I try to keep those pins, but finding them when you need them is almost impossible. Fortunately, a 3/32 Allen bit or Allen key works perfect, and the likelihood of you coming across a 3/32 Allen on a BMW is also slim to none. I would say 0. So we can go ahead and use that with no repercussions later on. That will lock the tensioner in place so that we can just slide not only the socket out, but also get the belt out. So be prepared with that as well. So at this point, obviously, you've seen some stuff change here. So we have this support bar across the engine right now. We're using the E-chassis tow hook. We'll give you the part number for that. The tow hook that comes with your car will not thread into the cylinder head. It's a totally different thread pitch, so you do need a different tow hook. With that said, we're using a support bar that uses 3 positions instead of the traditional 2. So depending on what support brace you're using or what method you're using to support the engine once you drop the subframe, this might look different. This is our setup. If you're using a 4-point or a 2-point, this is going to vary. With that said, this is our setup that we're choosing to use. And at this point, we're going to lift the car back up and we're going to start removing suspension components, subframe, all that good stuff. So with that said, let's get the car up in the air and let's move on. So at this point, we're going to start removing a bunch of the suspension components. I'm going to choose to unbolt the control arms from the subframe. So these two right here, this does have the M3 control arm upgrade, very popular on your E80, E90 chassis cars. So I'll just unbolt the control arms, those will droop down. I'm going to disconnect the tie rod from the steering knuckle, or the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle, both ends. The only difference here on the left side is we do have our headlight level sensor, which we will need to undo. Disconnect the sway bar links right here, and then that will remove the axle suspension from the subframe. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to start with the tie rod and get the nut loose first while everything is still tied together. It's going to be kind of difficult to attempt to do that if the control arm is no longer attached. So it's 22 millimeter. These lock nuts could be pretty tight, so of course the steering is moving, which is okay. I just need the nut to break free, and then I have to counter hold like so. All right. Now, these ball joints do not have a taper, so you do not need a ball joint separator or anything like that. This will spin all day unless you counter hold the stud. And I don't want the stud of the ball joint to spin because the ball seat of the ball joint has some dimples on it, which act as a locking mechanism into the aluminum knuckle. I really don't want to mar that up, so my focus is on simply getting the nut to come off the stud without the ball joint stud spinning at all. And like I said, there's no taper on these ball joints, so they just fall out. We're replacing these nuts, so I'm going to throw this in the trash. Next up, we have our sway bar link. I'm going to go disconnect that. It's a 16 millimeter nut, and we do have a counter hold here. I'm just going to hold that with some adjustable pliers. It's probably a 16 as well. All right, we're going to release the control arms from the subframe, 18 millimeter bolt for the thrust arm. The nut is encapsulated. It's a self-captured nut that slips onto the subframe. And we have an 18 millimeter bolt, 18 millimeter nut for the rearward wishbone. These bolts are torque to yield, so we will be replacing them. And that's the self-encapsulated nut I was telling you about. Just slips onto the subframe. Again, that's one-time use as well, so these are going to just be hucked in the trash or the recycling bin, whichever. Recycling bin. Captain Planet appreciates that. So now that we've done everything that we need to do on this side, I'm literally going to go ahead and mirror everything that we just did on this end, except we don't have to worry about the weirdness with that headlight level sensor. Next up, we need to remove the banjo bolts from the steering rack because we have our high pressure line in and then we have the return line out. So we got a 22 millimeter banjo bolt and a 19 millimeter banjo bolt. We'll break those loose free. That will also partially drain our power steering system, which is part of the process anyway, because the steering rack is coming with the subframe. And we're going to go ahead and release the 19 millimeter banjo bolt now. Do expect some fluid to come out, but not nearly as much as that larger banjo fitting. Yeah, not as much volume there. So this banjo bolt right here has a built-in check valve, as you can see. It's a sort of a drain back valve, if you will. If you track one of these cars, so road race or whatever, important to replace this with a banjo bolt that does not have the check valve in it, because if you have a curb strike with the wheels, the pressure that builds up from that could create a back pressure of the system, destroy the power steering pump as well as the end seals in the steering rack. So it's really not that necessary. Most people choose to delete this for that safety. So we could stand here all day and wait for these power steering hoses to stop dripping. I don't want to do that. So we have these little stoppers from CTA. They just simply slip onto the ends of the banjo line and it'll help reduce the mess. So I'm just gonna slide these on and that should allow us to stay a little bit cleaner. So what we have to do next is remove this Torx bolt here from the steering input shaft. This is going to allow for this coupler to come off the steering rack when we start to lower the subframe. Pointing to it now to show you where it is, because there's no way you're going to see that while I'm removing it. So just pointing to it for reference. And that E-Torx bolt is an E10. All right, so at this point, we are getting close to removing our subframe bolts and lowering the subframe. We do have this power steering hose, this pressure line that needs to come off the steering rack because it obviously can't come with the subframe. We also have a cooling hose up here that we need to be aware of. So that's kind of locked in place. We're gonna have to make sure that that's unhooked. And then once these hoses are loose, then we can start removing our subframe bolts. So I'm gonna start here, power steering line, 10mm nut. There we go. The actual bushing broke. I'm not surprised, they typically do, but they should come loose on their own without having to hold anything, like this one over here. So we will replace that bushing. It looked pretty petrified anyway, and not because it's scared, but old. That dad joke. So for our coolant transfer pipe that comes across the front of the subframe, it's held in place with 2 screws. I have a T27 socket on them right now, and they're coming loose. So T27 seems to be the right number. It feels like it's tight in there. It could be an Allen possibly, but we'll find out once we get out, because I actually can't really see it. Well, it's a Torx, but it's a T30, not a T27. T27 happened to work. So that's a very long screw for a very thin plastic flange. I'm gonna do the same thing on this side, but the water pump is not in the way. And now that plastic coolant pipe is loose. Like I said, very critical to loosen that coolant hose, because if you try to lower the subframe with that still connected, it's gonna break. And the job just got a lot harder, which you don't want. Next up, we're gonna remove the engine mount bolts. These are 13mm. Wrong way, dummy. And we will be replacing these. Also, if you're doing this job, whether it be an oil pan reseal or rod bearings or anything related to having to remove the subframe, now is a great time to take a look at the engine mounts and replace them if necessary. So we're gonna remove our center subframe bolts here. These are the E14s. I'm gonna leave the subframe bolts slightly loose, but enough for the subframe to lower down. I need to make sure that that steering shaft is gonna come out. And I don't wanna pull on the steering column while this is coming down. So I'm gonna loosen the subframe bolts a little bit, leave some threads in. Subframe's aluminum, so it's very light. I feel comfortable with it sitting on a handful of threads. I just wanna make sure everything comes loose accordingly. This rearward locating bolt for the subframe is 18mm. We'll just go ahead and pull that out entirely. And then our forward bolts are also E14. So this is at the point where you either need some kind of support for the subframe, or you bring in one of your friends, in this case, the one, the only, Michael Hidalgo. What's up, baby?
What's up, my good people?
All right. So the steering shaft is going to come off the steering rack, no problem. Went ahead and pushed up on it, and it's sliding right off the input. So now I'm just going to back these bolts out one at a time, and should be in a good place. All right, subframe is out of the way. We now have fairly clear access to the oil pan itself. However, there are several components that bolt to the oil pan, so you can't just start ripping out oil pan bolts. You need to disconnect certain things. Like, for example, the power steering pump mounts directly to the oil pan. We have the oil cooler lines of the transmission that are supported by the oil pan. We have an engine mount bracket over here. So what we need to do is remove these bolts that secure these other components in place first. And then once we do that, we have our bell housing bolts in the back for the transmission that go into the oil pan. And then once we kind of have all that stuff out of the way, then we'll start removing the oil pan bolts and get the oil pan out of the way. So first and foremost, I'm going to focus on our trans cooler lines. We have a 10mm nut up here, and there's a 10mm nut back here. I'm just gonna get the one in the front while I'm here. Obviously, we can really see the oil leak here. We're gonna do a lot of cleanup on this car. And, you know, make it look nice when it's all done. And what we'll do is we'll just thread the nut back on because it's sort of the bolt that slides into the little groove on the oil pan, which is right, I'll show you in a second. The little groove on the oil pan that counter holds the bolt right there. It just sort of slides out. So once you loosen it, you just pull it down and out. All right, core lines are loose. And actually, while I'm here and looking at it, we could just disconnect our oil level sensor because it's right here. I used some hose pliers just to hold onto those release tabs and walk the connector off. There's just so much debris and stuff that's caked in there, just made it difficult to press it with my hands. Next up, we'll start moving our power steering pump mount bracket bolts. So these are E12, and there's 3 of them. Power steering pump will dangle after this, but it's okay. And there it is. All right, we got 3 of these E10 bell housing bolts. These go directly into the oil pan. We have to remove them. These are not to be confused. There are some larger bolts. Those actually go into the engine block, so don't touch those. At this point, now I'm just gonna rip out every single E12 bolt that holds the oil pan to the engine bed plate. So let's have at it. Just gonna thread in these they're called oil pan snap-ups. They basically just thread into the block, or in this case, the bed plate. And we'll kind of hold everything together while I'm taking it apart. Of course, the thread pitch may not be the same, so that would be really unfortunate. All right, so on the N55 engine, the windage tray is also the oil pump pickup. You can see it's integrated all in one unit. It's plastic. It is a not great design for many reasons. We're gonna be replacing this as part of the job. And also, if you're doing an oil pan gasket replacement specifically, it's not a bad idea to replace this while you're in there, strictly because if there's any kind of micro cracking in the pickup tube, think about it this way. If you ever try to drink through a straw that has a crack in it, it's next to impossible. That would be your oil pump trying to scavenge oil from the sump. So I know for a fact that some of these have suffered from micro cracking. Just like the oil pan gasket becoming extremely brittle, you have to imagine this is probably going through the same process. So if you've gone this far, it doesn't make sense to me to not replace at the same time. But in our case, we need to pull it out. So we have a series of E10 bolts that go around the perimeter. We'll remove those and then we'll remove it out of the way. And also expect oil to come out once you pull this. And basically, we're just going to slide this into place. Heard it click. We got some of our new windage tray bolts. I'm going to thread these in just to hold it in position. Torque spec on our windage tray bolts is 4 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I'll just do the set torque first, and then we'll do the torque angle after. And for what it's worth, you will have some leftover bolts out of the kit because this kit applies to other engines than just the N52, which have different quantities of bolts. So if you notice on an N55 you have some leftovers, that's okay. All right, so we got the oil pan off along with the oil pan gasket. It pretty much came off all in one piece. Here's part of the rubber seal that, well, it's supposed to be rubber. It's not anymore. There's your leak. It happens on all these metallic / rubber oil pan gaskets. BMW doesn't really do RTV gaskets on a lot of these older engines. So this is almost always the result. So if you see a lot of oil at the bottom of the engine, it's always because this gasket has aged in this way. The rubber is oxidized. In this case, you know, this car is almost, it's 10 years old at this point, so 160,000 miles. It's been baked, it's been heated, it's been cooled off multiple times, and this stuff just doesn't hold up over a long period. It's plastic, it's brittle. There's your leak. All right, so at this point, we're going ahead and clean the mating surface of the bed plate. Use the plastic scraper. Fortunately, there wasn't any material left over from the oil pan that stuck to anything. So just went over it, wiped it down with a towel. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Don't use any kind of abrasives on it. It's a machine surface. You don't want to put any marks or grooves or anything like that into it, and there's no need to do that. I have these little holders here that are going to keep the oil pan gasket in place. You could also do it with zip ties, but these are also just as convenient. See, these little pop-ups, they just keep the oil pan gasket up in place, and then I'm going to slide the oil pan up and they'll do the same thing. And then I can start inserting some of the bolts. So at this point, the oil pan gasket are lined up and hanging here. So I'm gonna go ahead and start installing our shorter oil pan bolts. These are aluminum, one-time use, and they're all torqued to yield. So this is gonna take a while. And on top of that, we also have the bell housing bolts that we're gonna replace here at the back, those 3 that we removed, the E10s. But what I like to do is get all the oil pan bolts in loosely, get them all started by hand. Obviously make sure that they're all the correct size bolts. And then from there, we will start torquing them down. There is no torquing sequence for this oil pan gasket, so we can just work around the perimeter. All right, so now that we have all of the oil pan bolts installed and also our bell housing bolts, I'm gonna torque the oil pan bolts down first. It's 8 Newton meters plus 180 degrees of rotation. So what I'm gonna do is 8 Newton meters around the perimeter, starting with this back corner, and then I'll do 180 degrees on the second pass. Now that we've gone around the perimeter and tightened all of our oil pan bolts down, we're now going to do the 3 bell housing bolts. It's E10 and 19 Newton meters. All right, so at this point, oil pan is reinstalled. Now I need to get the trans cooler lines back up on the side of the oil pan because it does attach to it. So there's 2 brackets that have to go into these little notches here in the oil pan. And then once that's in, we'll put the power steering pump back in place. But I'm gonna start with the cooler lines first. In this case, in the front of the engine, you just have to slide it up into position and then tighten down the nut. That will also aid us in getting the one in the back done. And it's a 10 millimeter nut. If you want to torque it, 10 Newton meters would be perfectly fine. And you know what, while we're back here, let's plug in our oil level sensor. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and put our power steering pump back up in position. There's 2 holes in the front of the oil pan and then there's 1 on the side. I'm gonna go ahead and just get these started by hand. That'll give you enough wiggle room to line up the 2 holes on the front and the 1 hole on the side. If you tighten one of these bolts down all the way, you will never be able to line up the other holes. That's usually how that works. Torque spec on these power steering pump bolts is 38 Newton meters. All right, at this point, we have everything buttoned up that we need to button up on the oil pan. Everything's been torqued down. Now comes the fun part. We get to shove the subframe back up in here. And part of the process on that is also making sure that our steering shaft over here engages with the steering input shaft on the steering rack. We also need to make sure that the steering wheel is pointed in the straight ahead position, as well as the steering rack. We'll show you that next. So before we put the subframe back up into position, we need to make sure 2 things. Number 1, that the steering wheel is pointed in the steer head position. And we also need to make sure that the steering rack is preset into the steer head position. On the steering rack here, we have a little triangle, and then you have this piece in the casting here. I just put some paint pen on that just to mark it, but that is the steer head position. And as a quick reference check, just roughly looking at the tie rod ends, they come out to more or less the same place on the sway bar. So that is the steer head position. And to confirm, when we also looked at that, the steering coupler, where the bolt goes through, that is pointed in the down position. That's going to slip over that. And that's going to allow us to get the steering column reattached. So as I'm pushing this up into position, I'm just going to make sure that the steering shaft lines up with the steering rack, line up the bolt holes, everything will slip together, and we'll start getting everything bolted back on the car. So with that said, let's get to it. All right, so again, let's bring the subframe up. I'm just gonna take a look at the steering shaft, get that to slide onto our steering rack input shaft here. Also get the 2 forward bolt holes line up for the subframe on both sides. That third bolt hole towards the rear, that should relatively self-align. It is slotted, so I'm not too worried about that. But really, just making sure that the steering rack comes together first. And then once I know that's in place, make sure the engine mount's going into the pockets here on the subframe, and just make sure everything lines up. So we have the, there's a lot of moving around you have to do, but basically steering shaft is lined up. The steering shaft bolt or steering coupler bolt has already gone through and threads have been started. And make sure that as you're pushing the subframe up into position that the alignment dowel drops into the hole in the subframe. That is a really good indicator that you're in position. And obviously make sure it's the same way for both sides. So I got 4 of the subframe bolts started. I'm gonna make sure that the forward bolts start going in because that's actually what centers the subframe on the frame rails. There's an alignment dowel there, so I want that to be pulled in first, and then once those are pulled in, I can work on those rearward bolts. And these are E14s. I'm gonna use a ratchet to slowly bring it up into position. And these rearward bolts, if you had an alignment issue, you would not be able to get these in. So again, really important that you start from the front subframe bolts, work the centers up, and then you can finally put in the rears. We will torque all these to spec here in a moment, but just make sure these bolts are bottomed out. Torque spec on our subframe bolts, all 6 of them, is 108 Newton meters. I'm gonna start with the forward ones first, because like I said, those kind of locate everything. Next up, we'll put the engine mount bolts in. Torque spec for the engine mounts to the subframe, 13 millimeter drive, 28 Newton meters. So at this point, we need to put that steering shaft bolt back in. You can get at it through the top of the subframe. There's a nice hole there, but that's an E10. Bottom it out, and then we're gonna torque it to 24 Newton meters. And again, if that was not lined up appropriately, you would not be able to put the bolt through. If the bolt will not go through, that is not lined up correctly. All right, we're gonna reinstall our power steering, which this is a delicate balance of feeling it and kind of getting everything positioned. Obviously make sure the original crush washers are out of the way while we install the new ones. We'll get the bolt started by hand, and then our pressure line here, which is the bigger fitting. Again, just make sure that the crush washers are on. And there are none of the original ones, and we'll get that started by hand as well. So there's 2 different torque specs for these banjo bolts. The 19 millimeters, 30 Newton meters. The 22 millimeters, 35 Newton meters. So at this point, what's left for us to do underneath the car is to bolt the suspension back up to the subframe. We're using new hardware for that. It's all torque to yield stuff, and the lock nuts are lock nuts, so they should be replaced. Now it's just a matter of leveraging everything back into place. The bolts for the control arms are the same. The torque specs will be the same for those. One control arm, the thrust arm, needs to be torqued at right height. Our wishbone, which has a spherical inner, we could just torque that at droop. Doesn't make a difference. So let's just rearrange everything here. Kind of get everything back to its natural habitat where it wants to be. Like so. There we go. On the subframe, we have this nut that I was saying about when we took it apart. It just has like a little hook that it hooks onto. So we'll slide that into position. Nice satisfying click. Then we have our headlight level sensor arm, which the crimp just fell out when we took the car apart. So we're gonna have to replace that level sensor arm, but that's fine, that just is what it is. Put the tie rod nut on, at least to hold that in position. Both the control arm bolts are the same. They're class 8.8, which means it's 68 newton meters plus 90. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten down the ball joint nut for the tie rod end. It's a 21 millimeter nut and a 4 millimeter counter hold. Torque spec on the tie rod nut is 165 newton meters. Very awkward torquing position. I have a brand new lock nut on our sway bar end link here. It's a 16 millimeter nut. And the torque spec will be 58 newton meters. So the last thing that we need to do here with the suspension is torque our tie rod nuts to 165 newton meters. It's 21 millimeter. Okay, so now we're back up top. You'll notice that the engine support brace is no longer here. Well, it doesn't need to be because the subframe is back in with the engine mounts and everything else that is supporting the engine from underneath. So went ahead and removed that. Again, depending on which support method you're using, whether it's a 2-point brace, a 3-point, a 4-point, whatever, that installation is going to be totally dependent upon whatever method you're using to keep the engine supported. With that said, we're now at the point where we need to put the serpentine belt back in, put the fan back in, and then we also need to put oil in the engine so that we can prime it. So I'm going to go ahead and put our serpentine belt in first. I'm going to put a photo of the belt routing up here on the screen so you can see what that is. Of course, before you got to this point, you could always take a photo or draw your own diagram of what this looks like, but here's an image to show you what that looks like, since you're not going to be able to see how I'm routing it anyway. Yeah. Now you might remember earlier in the video I put a Allen wrench in there, but I actually found the tensioner pin. I always carry one with me, or I carry a collection of them with me when I know I'm working on a car, and I was able to find the right one, so I just swapped that out at one point. But the key is when you put any serpentine belt in, make sure that all of the ribs are sitting in the grooves on the pulleys, make sure it's not caught up on anything. Just check all that up front, and then that'll save you hassle just in case one of them is a little bit off. But having the tensioner in a locked position makes that process a lot easier because you're not fighting the tensioner while you're trying to route the belt. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our fan and fan shroud. I would say that installation is the reverse of removal, except not. We just really need to make sure it's not catching anything on the way down or pushing anything. Most notably, you need to make sure that the trans cooler below does not get pushed down because it is held onto the radiator by a plastic connector on the hose, and we don't want to break that. So just being really diligent about our movements here and getting this thing down into position. Of course, the AC hoses are in the way because they just are. The only thing helping us now is gravity. We're going to reinstall that 10 millimeter screw, which secures the fan to the radiator. Like I said, this is an aftermarket radiator, so that's not what would traditionally be holding this in place, but that's what is used to hold this radiator in place. We also need to go back down below to re-secure the transmission cooler to the fan shroud. One thing to note, the connection at the radiator, which is a quick disconnect fitting, if it moves side to side, it might drip a little bit of coolant. If you see that happening, don't worry about that too much. As long as it's seated squarely, it won't leak, which that's in a normal situation. Like I said, we're just gonna tighten that 10 millimeter screw down. We'll take our expansion tank hose next, clip it back to our fan shroud like so, and then we'll take our electrical connector and plug it into the fan shroud. Might just zip tie the wiring harness up over here afterwards. There's some indication that's the way it should be. So we'll zip tie that afterwards. It's not a big deal. All right, now we need to resecure our transcooler to the fan shroud. Now you notice that the fan shroud does not meet this aftermarket intercooler. And part of that is because this thing has been spaced down substantially. Not sure why that is, but that's going to be something that we're going to address after the fact. So anybody watching this video who's like, that's a problem, yes, I'm aware. And yes, I'm going to see if I can fix that. But for the sake of this video, we're just going to resecure our transcooler back to the fan shroud. And that is a T25 screw, BTW. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and put oil in the engine. I already put a brand new oil filter in when we first drained the oil, so that's all set to go. The drain plug on the oil pan was already torqued. We did that after we drained the oil. So really at this point, it's sort of like an oil change, except not really, because after we put oil in this, where we are right now in this process, we're going to prime the engine before we start it. That is a very critical procedure on the N55. Now, while BMW doesn't have a service bulletin that points to the N55 specifically needing this procedure done, that priming procedure came due to N55s failing after oil filter housing gasket replacements, vinyl sprocket replacements, oil pan gasket replacements, oil pump replacements, pretty much anything that involved opening up the oiling system at a major level. So in this case, since we replaced the rod bearings, the crankshaft itself has oil passages through it. We've completely removed all the connecting rods, put new bearings in. We also removed the oil pump. Oil pan came off. So in this case, we did a pretty intrusive repair on this engine. It's going to be super critical to make sure that we prime this engine, make sure it has oil pressure before we start it. That way, this engine has every chance at living another 160,000 miles, which is what we want. So with that said, we're going to fill it with oil. And then we're not going to show you the prime procedure in this video, but we will have a video linked, a little card that you can click that talks about what that process is. It's very simple. It's one extra step to make sure that you don't have a problem later on. In terms of the amount of oil I put in the engine, I put 6.75 liters, somewhere around there in. These will take 6.5 liters on a typical oil change. But because the oil pan was off and the residual in the oil pan came out, and obviously with the engine being open, dripped quite a bit of fluid out, oil pump removal, etc., it made sense to put a little bit more in. A dry start of one of these engines would be about 6.9 liters of oil. So I think 6.75 is a happy medium where it won't be overfilled, and should be on the money, but if we do need to top it up, we can do that. And while we're here, when I do this prime procedure, it's going to spin the power steering pump. So it does make sense to put some hydraulic fluid back in the system before we start it for real, and then have to bleed it out. So we'll just top this reservoir up. And we're just using the Liqui Moly central hydraulic system fluid. It is the equivalent of CHF11S. We had a couple bottles open here in the shop, so just choosing to use that. So you've primed the engine, which, like I said, we have a little video card that you can click on to take you there to see what that procedure is. But we're going to go ahead and put the spark plugs back in, ignition coils, hook up the injectors, all that good stuff, and start reassembling the rest of the car. So we're on the home stretch at this point. Before I put the torque wrench on these, I'm just going to make sure that they're fully seated. Remember earlier, number 3 was a little bit of a stubborn one to get to just because of the angle. So now we're going to go ahead and torque these spark plugs to 23 Newton meters. All right, so at this point, we will start plugging our injectors and our ignition coils back in. I'll do the injector first for the corresponding cylinder. Just want to hear a nice audible click. For our injectors, I like to push them down onto the spark plug first, then get the connector in. I like to push the connector in by hand so that the lock starts to drop down, close the gap, and then put our lock into place. Reason being is it is possible to close the lock without actually having the connector bottomed out. There we go. And then I'll wiggle the coil back and forth after it's bottomed out, just to make sure it is on the spark plug. And for the record, when you're putting the injector connectors back in, you'll see this little tab on the outside of the connector. That's going to correspond with this tab right here. That's the lock. So if you're concerned about orientation, just pay attention to that. Also, you won't be able to put it in the other way anyway. Also, some of these locks get kind of weak over time, so you can see that comes out very easily. Just make sure it's bottomed out, and then it shouldn't be a problem. Just going down the line here, making sure that everything is oriented correctly, which it is. All right, so now we have to reinstall our O2 sensor bracket, some of the pieces that hold the wiring harness in place, and we'll take it from there. I'm gonna reinstall this O2 connector bracket. And these are T25s if I recall. And I'll slide the connectors back into their home here. Next up, we need to slide this thing in. It sits on a handful of grommets, so we just need to make sure that those are locked in place. And then we'll route these cables into their respective locations. Now it's secured. Next up, we'll go ahead and reinstall our intake. Just need to make sure that this rubber boot goes over. Since this car does have a mass airflow sensor, any kind of air leak is going to cause a lean condition. And then this just sort of sits on a bunch of grommets, so just push into place like so. And then over here, we have a handful of wires. Also make sure your mass airflow sensor connector is not underneath anything. You want to be able to access that and plug it in. There we go. And then while we're over here, we'll slip these cables back onto their bracket, like so. So those are set. We will tighten down this hose clamp here. It's a 6mm. Plug our mass airflow sensor in, which we hear a nice little click when it goes. We have our fresh air intake right here, which goes in the front. That clicks into place, and then we just need to line these up here, put the screws in, and then we're going to go reinstall our strut brace here, V-brace. Just slide it through the little slot there. And get it to slide underneath the bolt in the back, which, by the way, you might recall, was sort of in rough shape. We have replaced it with a new one. E18 to the firewall, 100 Newton meters plus 100 degrees of rotation. Very interesting specification. Unfortunately, because of the damage at that portion of the strut brace from earlier, that one screw that was already stripped out, never going to be able to torque that. No matter what we do, it doesn't really seem to want to get any tighter than what it already is. So we're going to leave that alone. Went through there with a thread chaser, the whole 9 yards is what it is. We'll torque these at the strut tower though. At least that's bottomed out now. It won't make any knocking noise. At the strut towers here, our first torque sequence is 40 Newton meters. And it's E14. Our second is 6 degrees rotation. So at this point, everything's been buttoned back up. Now we're gonna start the car. And while it's running, we'll lift it up in the air, make sure that nothing's leaking from underneath. Also give us time to bleed out the power steering system, which at this point it's bled down quite a bit while sitting here. I'll turn the steering wheel back and forth, get fluid pumping through the steering rack and the power steering pump, and then we'll top up the power steering fluid after. Oil's not pouring out of it, staying inside the engine. There's no new leaks. We're good. Engine sounds healthy. We'll love to see. All right, and that's how you go about replacing the oil pan gasket on your E82 BMW 135i N55 powered car, 2011 to 2013. This process is going to be very similar for an E9X 3 Series, so E90, E92, E93 with the N55, and generally a very similar process if it's an N54 powered car or N52 powered car. So hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. We'll definitely get back to you. If you like this video, hit that like button. And we have a lot of videos on the way, so feel free to hit subscribe. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.